In Islamic thought, the word fitna refers to disorder, above all, to internal conflict that breaks out against an established ruler. When such conflict spreads or drags on, it has often been interpreted as a warning sign of the end of time. Some of the darkest verses of the Quran describe that final moment as a world turned upside down, with cosmic order collapsing, nature unraveling, and every soul forced to confront what it has done. Against this background, the events that unfolded in al-Andalus between 1008 and 1031 could easily have felt to contemporaries like the approach of a terrible reckoning. After the death of Abd al-Malik, members of the Umayyad family attempted to reclaim direct control. A great-grandson of Abd al-Rahman III overthrew the powerless Hisham II, proclaimed himself caliph under the name Muhammad II, seized al-Mansur's palace city of al-Madinah al-Zahira, and ordered it destroyed. This dramatic reversal took place during the winter of 1008 to 1009. The Berber commanders, unwilling to accept this outcome, elevated another Umayyad descendant, Sulayman, as a rival caliph. To strengthen his position, Sulayman sought help from the Christian north and received military support from Sancho Garcia, Count of Castile. Muslim and Christian forces marched together on Córdoba and defeated Muhammad II in November 1009. Sulayman entered the capital as caliph. The struggle did not end there. Muhammad fled to Toledo and appealed to a different set of Christian allies. In response, the leading figures of Catalonia, the Counts of Barcelona and Urgell, led armies south and defeated Sulayman and his Berber supporters in May 1010. Andalusi chroniclers later remembered this moment as the year of the Catalans. Muhammad returned to Córdoba, but his victory was brief. He was assassinated in July, and Hisham II was restored once again as caliph by his remaining supporters. Sulayman then advanced on the capital, occupied the palace of Madinat az-Zahra, and turned it into a base for his Berber troops. From there, he blockaded Córdoba for more than 2 years. During this time, Berber forces roamed large parts of southern and eastern Iberia, sustaining themselves by plunder and by extorting payments from cities in exchange for protection. The damage they inflicted on countryside and towns alike was immense. Inside Córdoba, conditions grew desperate. Refugees crowded into the city from surrounding districts. Heavy rains in the spring of 1011 caused the Guadalquivir to flood. Disease followed. The government, starved of revenue, resorted to selling off parts of the great library assembled under al-Hakim II. In May 1013, the city finally surrendered. Berber troops entered, looted, and destroyed. The remaining books of the caliphal library were scattered. Large numbers of inhabitants were killed. The young Ibn Hazm, later one of the most famous intellectuals of the age, witnessed the massacre and later recorded the names of more than 60 scholars who lost their lives. One of them lay unburied in the street for days. Hisham II vanished from the record and was assumed to have been murdered. Sulayman remained caliph for 3 years, though his authority barely extended beyond his own name. His Berber followers treated Córdoba as conquered territory, killing and looting at will. To keep their loyalty, Sulayman distributed provinces and governorships, often merely recognizing control that his generals already exercised. Among those rewarded was Zawi ibn Ziri, leader of a Berber tribe, who received authority over the province of Elvira. In 1016, one of Sulayman's own generals turned against him, deposed him, and had him executed. The caliphate lingered on in name for another 15 years. A series of short-lived puppet caliphs appeared and disappeared in rapid succession. Their reigns were marked by intrigue, violence, and manipulation by soldiers, officials, and urban crowds. One ruled for barely more than a month. Most died violently. In 1031, the last of them, Hisham III, was expelled from Córdoba and faded into obscurity. No replacement was appointed. The caliphate of Córdoba was finished. The civil war of these years marked a brutal end to an era. The destruction of Córdoba and of the palace cities that had symbolized caliphal power was not merely physical but symbolic. The intervention of Christian rulers in Andalusi politics reversed patterns that had prevailed only a generation earlier and foreshadowed a future in which northern powers would play an ever larger role. By 1031, the central question was no longer who would rule from Córdoba, but whether Córdoba would rule at all. The answer was already clear. Central authority collapsed, and the fragile unity imposed in earlier decades dissolved. In its place emerged a patchwork of regional successor states, usually centred on cities and their surrounding countryside. These new regimes came to be known as the Taifa kingdoms, ruled by amirs later called the Taifa kings, a term that reflects their origins in factional struggle. The birth of these states was violent and insecure. Granada provides one revealing example. The Berber leader, Zawi ibn Ziri, had been granted authority over Elvira, an old city in the fertile plain below the Sierra Nevada. This region had suffered badly during the years of Berber raiding. Later tradition claimed that the people of Elvira invited Zawi to rule them and promised loyalty in exchange for protection. This story is difficult to believe, given recent experience. It is more likely that Zawi seized control by force and then obtained formal recognition after the fact. Such stories of invitation served later to legitimize new dynasties. One of Zawi's first acts was to abandon Elvira, exposed on the plain, and establish a new stronghold in the hills nearby. This settlement became Granada. Retreating to a defensible site was a common response in an age of uncertainty, and Granada's origins reflect the insecurity of the time. Similar takeovers by Berber commanders occurred across the south, at places such as Algeciras, Malaga, Ronda, and even across the straits at Ceuta. The details are clearest for Granada because of an extraordinary source: the memoirs of Abd Allah, the last ruler of the Zirid dynasty, written after his deposition in 1090. Long thought lost, the text was rediscovered in the 20th century and provides an unusually vivid picture of Taifa politics. Abd Allah emerges as a perceptive, but not especially strong ruler, whose candid writing offers rare insight into daily life, intrigue, and fear in the age of the party kings. Not all Taifa states arose from military coups. In more distant provinces, where Cordoba's authority had always been weak, local families who had governed on behalf of the caliph simply continued to rule independently. This pattern appeared in places like Toledo, Zaragoza, and Albarracin. Elsewhere, power fell to civil administrators who had risen under Almanzor. Some were former slaves or freedmen who had made careers in government. At Badajoz, for example, authority was taken by Saber, a former slave who had served Al-Hakam II and later governed much of the western peninsula. After his death in 1022, his sons inherited his position. In Denia, a former military commander of slave origin, Mujahid, created a maritime state that dominated the Balearic Islands, and even attempted the conquest of Sardinia. Though a corsair and warlord, he also patronized religious scholarship, assembling learned men to study the text of the Quran. These categories overlap and shift. Taifa states were fragile creations. Rulers were frequently overthrown by ministers, relatives, or rivals. Boundaries were uncertain, loyalties unstable. Each ruler was surrounded by family members with claims and ambitions, and alliances shifted constantly. Survival depended on diplomacy, bribery, and war. Over time, smaller states were absorbed by larger ones. By the middle of the century, a handful of major powers emerged: Seville and Granada in the south, Badajoz, Toledo, and Valencia across the centre, and Zaragoza in the northeast. Among these, Seville grew strongest. In Seville, power fell to the Abbadid family. Muhammad ibn Abbad combined wealth, land ownership, and judicial authority. His family controlled vast agricultural resources in the rich Guadalquivir Valley, famous for olive oil, dyes, sugar, and trade. Under his son al-Mu'tadid and grandson al-Mu'tamid, Seville expanded aggressively, absorbing neighbouring states and even capturing Córdoba itself. Al-Mu'tadid celebrated his victories in poetry, while other poets mocked the grandiose titles of Taifa rulers as inflated and absurd. Yet mockery did not change reality. By the late 11th century, Seville dominated southern al-Andalus. Despite political instability, economic recovery was rapid. Agriculture revived, trade routes reopened, and wealth accumulated. Taifa rulers used this wealth to patronize the arts. With Cordoba no longer monopolizing culture, creativity spread to provincial centers. Ivory carving flourished at Cuenca under princely support. Palaces, mosques, bridges, walls, and waterworks were built across the peninsula, though many survive only in fragments or descriptions. Scholars, scientists, and poets found patrons in multiple courts. Some rulers were themselves learned. Others gathered scholars around them. Poetry flourished, especially at Seville, where the Abbadid court cultivated a culture of elegance, pleasure, and display. Al-Mu'tadid and al-Mu'tamid were accomplished poets, and their court attracted figures like Ibn Hamdis, a refugee from Norman-conquered Sicily, whose verses celebrate wine, music, and fleeting joy. This hedonistic tone became characteristic of the age. Standing apart from this courtly world was Ibn Hazm of Córdoba. He refused attachment to any Taifa ruler and remained loyal to the idea of Umayyad legitimacy. His independence brought isolation and persecution, but it also produced some of the most remarkable works of the age. His writings on love, belief, and religious divisions show immense learning and sharp psychological insight. Yet his engagement with Christianity and Judaism was intellectual rather than conciliatory. He studied their texts in Arabic translation, not to seek dialogue, but to argue against them. Such curiosity was rare. Most Muslims and Christians of the period showed little interest in understanding one another beyond stereotypes. Christian communities in al-Andalus generally adopted a posture of quiet obedience. A revealing episode comes from the life of John of Gauls. When he insisted on presenting letters hostile to Islam, a local bishop urged restraint, arguing that submission to civil authority was necessary, so long as faith itself was not threatened. Survival, not confrontation, shaped daily life. Thus, the age of fitna gave birth to a fragmented but vibrant world. Central power collapsed, but regional creativity surged. Violence and insecurity coexisted with cultural brilliance. The Taifa kingdoms emerged from chaos, rich, competitive, and fragile, setting the stage for the next dramatic transformation of al-Andalus. In practical terms, the safest course for Christian communities living under Islamic rule was simple. Avoid attention, and life would continue without serious trouble. Among the Arabized Christians of al-Andalus, there was little interest in understanding Islam from within. Christian thinkers showed no curiosity about Muslim scripture, theology, or belief, not even at an informal level. This reluctance was not caused by lack of access. Accurate information was close at hand, embedded in daily urban life. Yet stereotypes proved easier and more comfortable than inquiry. An episode from the 9th century illustrates this clearly. A Christian traveller from Córdoba visiting the northern principality of Pamplona came across a Latin biography of the Prophet Muhammad in the library of a monastery. The work was wildly distorted and hostile, yet it was accepted without question because it confirmed assumptions already in place. It has often been remarked that far better information could have been obtained simply by speaking to Muslims back home in Córdoba. But both communities preferred inherited images to the unsettling work of understanding one another. Daily life in the cities of al-Andalus brought Christians and Muslims into constant contact. In some towns, Christians lived in clearly defined quarters, while in others they were interspersed among Muslim neighbours. Markets, streets and workshops were shared spaces. Evidence from moral regulations shows how closely intertwined ordinary life had become. A legal writer warned Muslims not to work as labourers or stable hands for Christians, advice that only makes sense if such arrangements were already common. Trade flowed across religious boundaries, extending well beyond books into everyday goods. Some prohibitions reveal even more. Muslim women were warned away from Christian churches, accused of socializing too freely there. Such language mirrored accusations Christians themselves often made against Muslims. Mutual suspicion existed on both sides, expressed in familiar moral clichés. Another source reveals that certain wealthy Muslims frequented Christian monasteries as discreet places to drink wine forbidden by Islamic law. These glimpses suggest that real life was far more complex than official attitudes admitted. By the time of the Taifa kingdoms, Christians likely formed only a small minority in major cities. The countryside may have been different. Evidence here is sparse, as most surviving records focus on urban life. Yet it seems probable that large rural areas, especially in mountainous or remote regions, remained largely untouched by Islam. Written sources occasionally mention Christian populations in outlying districts, as if their presence were entirely unremarkable. These rural communities may have lived culturally apart from the dominant society, maintaining their own traditions and perhaps feeling increasingly alienated from urban centres. In this sense, al-Andalus contained internal frontiers as well as the external boundary facing the Christian north. These divisions did not apply in the same way to Jewish communities. Jews were overwhelmingly urban and integrated into the commercial life of cities. Their communities could be substantial. Toledo alone had numerous synagogues. Fragmentary records point to a prosperous middle class deeply engaged in long-distance trade. Jewish merchants in Iberia were part of vast commercial networks, linking Spain with North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond. Letters from merchants reveal astonishingly complex chains of exchange, involving luxury goods that originated thousands of miles away. Spanish Jewry was deeply embedded in global trade systems stretching from the Atlantic to Asia. In this context, earlier diplomatic links between Andalusi Jews and distant Jewish centres appear entirely natural. Jewish individuals rose to prominence in several Taifa states. The most striking figure was Samuel ibn Nagrila. Born in Cordoba, he fled the city during the chaos of the early 11th century and eventually settled in Granada. There, he entered the service of the ruling dynasty and rapidly became indispensable. Through political skill and careful management of a succession crisis, he emerged as the effective head of government. For nearly 2 decades, he directed the affairs of the state. Samuel was an unusual figure, combining military command, administrative authority, religious leadership, and literary talent. He was respected by Muslim rulers and remembered with honour by later chroniclers. His poetry reflects both the brutality of war and the resilience of spirit required to survive it. His son Joseph inherited his position, reinforcing how deeply Jewish elites could be embedded in Taifa politics. That position, however, was precarious. In Granada, opposition eventually crystallized around religious arguments. A legal scholar stirred public hostility by portraying Jewish influence as an affront to Islamic norms. His inflammatory verses spread rapidly. In 1066, violence erupted, Joseph was killed, and many Jews were massacred. This tragedy stands out precisely because it was exceptional. For the most part, the 11th century was a period of security and cultural vitality for Spanish Jewry. Jewish intellectual life flourished. Scholars travelled across Europe in search of learning. Spanish Jews studied in the Rhineland and France, while foreign teachers were recruited to Iberian communities. Patronage followed wealth and power, just as it did in Islamic society. One of the greatest figures of the age was Solomon ibn Gabirol, whose philosophical and poetic works would later influence thinkers far beyond Spain. His career illustrates how Jewish culture benefited from the decentralized political landscape created by the Taifa system. Yet fragmentation carried a heavy cost. Rivalry among the Taifa states made them vulnerable to exploitation. Where once caliphs had intervened in Christian politics, now Christian rulers intervened in Muslim affairs. Northern armies were hired as mercenaries. Tribute flowed south to north. Gold became a weapon more effective than armies. This system evolved into an organized extraction of wealth. Taifa rulers paid annual sums in exchange for protection or military support. These payments enriched Christian kings and transformed their political capacity. The gold funded armies, churches, and ambitious expansion. It attracted adventurers from across Europe, bringing with them new attitudes toward war, conquest, and faith. The arrangement was unstable. Power shifts altered who paid whom. Taifa rulers played Christian rivals against one another. Treaties were drafted, alliances renegotiated, threats implied rather than stated. Surviving agreements reveal the blunt realities behind polite language. Monthly payments of gold were fixed, advance sums demanded, hostages exchanged. First-hand accounts show how humiliating these negotiations could be. Taifa rulers pleaded poverty, argued strategic necessity, and offered lavish gifts to soften demands. Even so, the flow of gold continued. Survival depended on compromise. The Taifa world also created space for adventurers who crossed boundaries with ease. One such figure was Ibn Ammar, a poet and political operator whose career took him from obscurity to power and back again. His rise and fall was dramatic, marked by ambition, betrayal, exile, and violence. His life mirrored the instability of the age. On the Christian side, a parallel figure emerged in Rodrigo Diaz, later known as El Cid. Stripped of legend, he appears as a skilled soldier and negotiator who served Muslim and Christian rulers alike. Exile forced him into mercenary service. Success made him independent. He fought for pay, for territory, and ultimately for himself. By the end of his life, he ruled Valencia as a personal domain, a Christian Taifa in all but name. The age of the Taifa kings was therefore an era of contradiction. Cultural creativity flourished as never before. Art, poetry, scholarship, and science spread across Iberia. At the same time, political fragmentation weakened the foundations of Andalusi power. Tribute drained resources. External influence grew. One final consequence was the loss of influence across the Straits of Gibraltar. Earlier rulers of al-Andalus had maintained a close watch on North Africa. The Taifa states could not coordinate such policy. Even Seville, dominant though it was, failed to act decisively. A story from the court of Seville captures the irony. News arrived that a Berber movement in Morocco had founded a new city called Marrakesh. Courtiers dismissed it as irrelevant. The ruler did not. He warned that these people would one day cross into Iberia and ordered defences strengthened. His intuition proved correct. The forces that emerged from Marrakesh eventually crossed the straits. They dismantled the world of the Taifa kings with brutal speed. Cultured courts collapsed. Poets fell silent. Rulers were exiled or imprisoned. The elegant but fragile order of the party kings vanished when improvisation met disciplined power. The cats had ruled briefly. The lions had arrived. By the closing decades of the 11th century, the balance of power in the Iberian Peninsula shifted dramatically. From North Africa arrived a movement rooted in strict religious reform. Its followers were known as the Almoravids. They crossed the sea at first as allies, summoned by the Muslim rulers of Iberia, who feared growing pressure from the Christian north. Yet the alliance was brief. Once established, the newcomers moved swiftly to dismantle the very states that had invited them, bringing all of al-Andalus under their authority. Their rule, however, proved unstable. Life in the fertile cities of southern Spain softened the rigid discipline that had once given the Almoravids their strength. Resistance began to surface by the middle of the 12th century. At the same time, Christian kingdoms exploited this weakening grip to push southward. Meanwhile, in Morocco, another reformist movement emerged, one even more uncompromising than the first. These were the Almohads. By the middle of the 12th century, they had destroyed Almoravid power in North Africa. Soon after, they crossed into Iberia and replaced the Almoravid rule entirely. By this stage, the Christian powers of Leon Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, and the young Kingdom of Portugal had grown into formidable forces. Although the Almohads enjoyed a period of success and won a major victory late in the century, their advance was ultimately halted. A decisive defeat early in the 13th century shattered their power. Over the next several decades, Christian armies captured most of the remaining Muslim-held cities. Córdoba fell first, then Valencia, and finally Seville. These conquests proved permanent. This outlines the broad military and political developments of the period, from the late 11th to the mid-13th century. To understand why events unfolded in this way, one must look beyond battles and rulers to deeper patterns. Centuries later, a North African thinker reflected on the recurring rise and fall of Berber powers. He argued that harsh environments produced resilient societies, marked by strong internal cohesion. Such communities, hardened by scarcity, made formidable warriors. Yet physical toughness alone did not explain their success. What transformed strength into conquest was religious conviction. Shared belief dissolved rivalries, unified purpose, and turned scattered tribes into a single force prepared to fight and die for a common cause. When these elements aligned, expansion followed. But victory carried the seeds of decay. Exposure to wealth, comfort, and urban life weakened discipline. Over time, conquerors absorbed the habits of the societies they ruled. Their unity dissolved, leaving them vulnerable to the next wave rising from the margins. The Almoravid movement fit this pattern closely. Its origins lay among Berber tribes, living on the edges of the Sahara. Although these peoples had embraced Islam earlier, their practice was superficial. A religious teacher arrived among them in the middle of the 11th century with the aim of enforcing stricter observance. His message was initially rejected. Forced to withdraw, he and a handful of followers established a small religious community along the Atlantic coast. The group lived simply, trained themselves for defense, and spread their teachings by example. Over time, this disciplined community grew. Converts joined. The movement promised unity beyond tribal divisions and offered moral clarity in a fragmented society. After years of preparation, it returned to confront the tribes that had once dismissed it. Within 2 decades, the entire confederation had submitted. Leadership passed to a new generation, and one commander led the movement north across the mountains into the heart of Morocco, founding a new capital that would soon dominate the region. As the Almoravids expanded, they encountered the Muslim rulers of Iberia. The gulf between them was profound. The Taifa courts of al-Andalus were heirs to centuries of urban culture, literature, and refined customs. The Almoravids came from a stark world of austerity. Their leaders lived simply, spoke Arabic imperfectly, and rejected the elegance of Andalusi court life as corrupt and irreligious. They saw themselves as enforcers of religious purity, charged with restoring proper conduct. From their perspective, the rulers of Iberia stood guilty of serious violations. They had abandoned allegiance to the wider Islamic authority. They paid tribute to Christian kings, something forbidden under religious law. To meet these demands, they imposed taxes lacking legal sanction. In some states, Jews exercised authority over Muslims, an arrangement that deeply troubled conservative opinion. These were not minor faults, but fundamental breaches. Other practices added to the charge. Astrology flourished at court despite religious objections. Wine and music filled palaces. Rulers sought pleasure and prediction rather than piety. Contemporary critics condemned what they saw as moral decay. Some voices accused the Taifa rulers of betraying their faith and endangering the community. Tribute itself could not remain merely financial. Christian kings relied on warrior elites who demanded land, captives, and conquest. What began as protection payments evolved into territorial expansion. Cities were taken, populations expelled, and new settlements established. Toledo, once protected, became absorbed outright. Its fall sent shockwaves through Muslim Iberia. Fear drove the remaining rulers to seek help from across the sea. The Almoravids answered the call. Their arrival brought a crushing defeat to Christian forces and halted further advance. Suspicion ran both ways. Andalusi rulers feared their allies. Almoravid leaders despised the decadence they encountered. Soon, encouraged by religious authorities and emboldened by defections, the Almoravids moved against the Taifa kings themselves. One by one, rulers were deposed and exiled. Their courts fell silent. Their wealth was seized. The new regime reunited al-Andalus, but under harsher terms. It became an extension of North African rule. Religious policy grew stricter. Christian and Jewish communities faced increasing pressure. Churches were destroyed. Bishops imprisoned. Many Christians fled north, while others were forcibly relocated across the sea. This repression intensified hostility in the Christian kingdoms. It also ended the flow of gold that had sustained them. Royal finances collapsed. Alliances frayed. Even distant institutions suffered. A great monastery in Burgundy, long supported by Iberian tribute, faced crisis when payments stopped. Yet the connections forged earlier endured. Religious reform spread through Spain. Clergy from across Europe arrived. Noble families crossed the mountains seeking land, reward, and glory. Epic traditions shaped their outlook. To fight in Iberia was to reenact legendary struggles against the infidel. These warriors came not only as soldiers, but as governors and settlers. They carried with them ideas of conquest, faith, and destiny that reshaped the peninsula. What had begun as local conflict became part of a wider transformation. The arrival of North African reformers restored unity to Muslim Spain for a time, but at a high cost. Rigid discipline replaced flexibility. Hostility hardened, the balance tipped when the next wave of reformers arrived. Even more severe, the fragile equilibrium collapsed entirely. The world of Taifa courts, poetry, compromise, and fragile alliances disappeared. A harsher age took its place, shaped by ideology, conquest, and irreversible change. The religious world of the feudal elite was shaped by two dominant practices: pilgrimage and war. Noblemen and noblewomen travelled to sacred sites, and aristocratic warriors fought in conflicts that church leaders defined as holy. These church leaders were often members of the same noble families as the warriors themselves. Among the most important pilgrimage destinations of the age was the tomb of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. The shrine drew travellers from across Europe and played a quiet but powerful role in introducing many of them to the possibilities that Spain offered, both spiritual and worldly. At the same time, warfare was being given a new religious meaning. The idea of fighting for God was not new in Christian thought, but during the 11th century it was reshaped into something far more aggressive. War against non-Christians began to be presented not merely as a defensive necessity, but as an act that could earn spiritual reward. For a Christian knight, combat against the infidel was increasingly described as a path to salvation. From this idea emerged the foundations of crusading ideology. The Pope who turned this developing concept into action was Urban II. In 1095 he addressed a large gathering at Clermont, an audience dominated by French warrior aristocrats. Urban himself came from a noble French family and had once been a monk at Cluny. When the First Crusade set out, many prominent nobles joined the expedition that would capture Jerusalem in 1099. Among them were the Counts of Perche, Béarn, and Bigorre. Another French noble and former Cluniac monk stood among the listeners at Clermont but did not take the cross. Instead, he would play a decisive role in Spain. This man was Bernard, newly appointed Archbishop of Toledo. Bernard possessed enormous energy and unwavering confidence. His background shaped his attitudes, and in his dealings with Muslims, he showed little inclination toward compromise. When Toledo was conquered, King Alfonso VI had allowed the Muslim population to retain their main mosque and continue worship there. Bernard overturned this policy. He seized the mosque and transformed it into his cathedral, and evidence suggests that he carried out similar actions throughout his diocese, from the Tagus River north to the Guadarrama Mountains. These events unfolded during a broader movement of church reform often associated with Pope Gregory VII. The reformers believed the church had been corrupted by its entanglement with secular power. Their response was to sever those ties. Clerical celibacy was enforced, and lay involvement in the appointment of bishops and abbots was condemned. A purified clergy, they argued, should guide society itself, assigning roles to the laity and supervising their fulfillment. Authority would flow upward through bishops and archbishops to the Pope. Redirecting secular violence into enterprises sanctioned by the Church became a central feature of this vision. Crusading warfare fit perfectly within that framework. Bernard of Toledo emerged as the leading reformer in the Spanish Church. Under his influence, Spain's ecclesiastical institutions were drawn into much closer alignment with Rome. Spanish churchmen were encouraged to attend papal councils and return home to enforce reforming legislation. Bernard brought reform-minded clergy from France and placed them in positions of power across Castile. By the early 12th century, nearly every diocese in the region was held by one of his associates. One of them, Raymond of Osma, later succeeded Bernard as Archbishop of Toledo. Bernard also collaborated with Alfonso the Battler of Aragon in founding a military brotherhood whose members pledged never to live at peace with Muslims and to dedicate their lives to fighting them. All of this had profound consequences for Islamic Spain. During the first half of the 12th century, relations between Christians and Muslims grew increasingly hostile. On the Muslim side, this shift was driven by the rise of the Almoravids. On the Christian side, it was shaped by imported ideas carried into Spain by monks from Cluny, foreign warriors, reforming clergy, pilgrims, and papal agents. The earlier strategy of extracting tribute from Muslim neighbours was gradually replaced by a program of outright conquest framed in religious terms. This transformation did not occur suddenly, and the political realities of the 12th century resist simple division. The Iberian Peninsula was not a battlefield between two unified religious camps. Alliances crossed confessional lines, and individual careers often defied ideological boundaries. One such example is Saif al-Dawla, son of the last Hudid ruler of Zaragoza. After his father was overthrown by the Almoravids, Saif al-Dawla held a small territory near Rueda for 2 decades. After his death, he entered the service of the Christian king Alfonso VII, surrendered his lands, and was rewarded with military commands on the frontier near Toledo. He fought alongside Christian armies against Muslim territories and appeared at royal ceremonies, including Alfonso's imperial coronation. Later, he played a leading role in revolts against Almoravid rule in southern Spain and briefly held power in Córdoba. When Almoravid authority collapsed, he attempted to carve out a new principality, but was eventually killed under suspicious circumstances by agents of the very king he had served. Movement also occurred in the opposite direction. Reverter, a Catalan noble and viscount, was captured by the Almoravids and entered their service as a mercenary. Despite Almoravid hostility to Christianity, they employed Christians in military and administrative roles. Reverter fought against the rising Almohads in North Africa and died there. His widow returned to Catalonia, where her tomb bears inscriptions in both Latin and Arabic. Of their sons, one became a Muslim and joined the Almohads. The other returned to Spain, served the Count of Barcelona, signed documents in Arabic, lent money to the government, and eventually joined the Knights Templar. Such careers were made possible by the gradual weakening of Almoravid rule. Although the Almoravids had entered al-Andalus as defenders of Islam, they ruled as conquerors. Their leadership was devout, but discipline among the rank and file was poor. Their administration relied heavily on Andalusi officials shipped to Morocco, while Berber elites remained detached from local society. They indulged in luxury, failed to recover lost territories, alienated Christians and Jews through persecution and taxation, and became divided by tribal rivalries. Revolts began as early as 1119, and within a generation their authority was unravelling. At the same time, a new threat emerged in Morocco. The Almohad movement arose under the leadership of Muhammad ibn Tumat, a Berber religious reformer influenced by Islamic thought from the eastern Mediterranean. He denounced Almoravid corruption, preached strict monotheism, destroyed symbols of moral decay, and eventually withdrew to the Atlas Mountains. There, he built a disciplined movement that transcended tribal divisions. In 1121, he was proclaimed the Mahdi by his followers, and after his death, his successor, Abd al-Mumin, transformed the movement into a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic to Tunisia and into Spain. By the mid-12th century, Almoravid power collapsed entirely. Rebellions spread across al-Andalus, central authority disintegrated, and local rulers emerged once again. External intervention followed, confusion reigned, and the peninsula entered another period of fragmentation. It is within this turbulent landscape that the next phase of Iberian history would unfold. In the southwest of the peninsula, the collapse of Almoravid authority did not produce a neat transfer of power. It opened space for religious movements, local revolts, shifting alliances, and sudden violence. One of the most striking figures to emerge in this region was Ibn Qasi. a spiritual teacher and mystic associated with the Sufi tradition. He gathered followers into a movement known as al-Muridin, a name that suggested disciplined devotion and religious training. Their base was at Seville, where a fortified religious community served as both sanctuary and headquarters. The Almoravids tried repeatedly to crush the group, but they failed to eliminate it. Then, in 1144, rebellion spread across the Algarve. Almoravid control fractured, towns and districts moved in different directions, and the region slid into a confused struggle for survival. In that turmoil, Ibn Qasi looked beyond Iberia for backing and appealed to the Almohads, whose rising power across the straits was already reshaping North Africa. The Almohads responded decisively. In 1146, an Almohad force crossed into Spain and, with Ibn Qasi as an ally, helped seize Seville, a major city that had resisted earlier uprisings and remained loyal to the Almoravid cause. Yet the partnership did not last. Ideological differences, rival ambitions, and the practical realities of military occupation quickly turned cooperation into conflict. Fighting broke out between Almohad forces and the Muridin, and the imbalance was severe. Ibn Qasi was pushed back toward his original base at Silves. There, in 1151, he was assassinated. With his death, the movement lost its cohesion, and the Almohads retained control of the Algarve, turning a temporary intervention into a lasting foothold. In eastern and southeastern Iberia, the pattern was different. After the death of Saif al-Dawla in 1146, a new power broker seized the opportunity presented by the crumbling Almoravid order. Muhammad ibn Mardanish established himself at Murcia and Valencia and built an independent principality that became one of the most significant obstacles to Almohad expansion. Christian sources gave him a memorable name, King Wolf, and his reputation reflected a political style that seemed unusually adaptable. He was prepared to bargain with Castile and Aragon, accept subsidies, and trade concessions for security. He was not seen as an unpredictable turncoat in the manner of earlier figures. Instead, he presented himself as a reliable partner for Christian rulers, precisely because his survival depended on keeping Almohad armies at a distance. He also understood the value of image. He cultivated a public identity that blended cultures, rather than insisting on separation. Romance speech was used where Arabic might have been expected, and his court adopted the dress, habits, and martial style familiar to Western aristocrats. This was not simple imitation. It was political theatre designed to reassure allies and intimidate rivals. Through careful diplomacy, Christian financial support, and continuous fighting, he preserved his state for decades. At its height, his territory covered much of the southeastern quarter of the peninsula. More importantly, it delayed Almohad consolidation for roughly a generation, forcing the Almohads to spend years grinding against a frontier that refused to collapse. While Muslim powers struggled among themselves, Christian rulers were quick to exploit the instability. Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile pursued an ambitious policy in the 1130s and 1140s, attempting to follow the expansionist path of his grandfather, the conqueror of Toledo. From bases along the Tagus, raids pushed deep into the south. The disorder of the mid-century revolts gave him rare openings. In 1146, for a brief moment, Córdoba fell into his hands. The following year brought an even bolder move. In cooperation with Genoese allies who supplied ships and maritime expertise, Alfonso captured the port of Almeria. This gave Castile something it had never had before, a direct outlet onto the Mediterranean. Yet these gains did not endure. The Almohads recovered Córdoba in 1148 and retook Almeria in 1157. The episode revealed both the possibilities created by Andalusi fragmentation and the limits of Christian power when a strong North African empire committed itself to reconquest. Farther west, however, a conquest achieved in the same era proved permanent and changed the political map for good. The Portuguese county had long been tied to the politics of Leon and Castile, but a new generation pushed toward independence. Afonso, the son of Count Henry and Teresa, emerged as the central figure. He broke away from the authority of his cousin Alfonso VII and built legitimacy through war, diplomacy, and recognition from the papacy. In 1139, he won a major victory against an Almoravid army. Soon afterward, he adopted the title of king, and in 1143 he secured formal acknowledgement of his monarchy by Rome. This recognition mattered because it anchored Portuguese independence in international religious authority as well as in battlefield success. Afonso's most famous early triumph came in 1147 with the capture of Lisbon. He arranged for ships from England and the Low Countries to join the campaign. The city was attacked from the sea while Portuguese forces sealed it off on land, creating a coordinated siege that squeezed defenders from both directions. An English participant later wrote an account of the operation that reads like first-hand military reporting, unusually vivid for the period. The new bishop appointed to Lisbon after its fall was also English, Gilbert of Hastings. These details mark the beginning of a durable relationship between Portugal and the English world, one that would continue to shape diplomacy and commerce long after the siege ended. After Lisbon, some of the same ships sailed eastward into the Mediterranean and assisted another major capture, Tortosa at the mouth of the Ebro, taken by Ramon Berenguer IV in 1148. Some northern Europeans even settled in Catalonia, becoming part of the human movement tied to crusading roots and frontier opportunities. These years around the middle of the 12th century brought moments of optimism to Christian kingdoms, but the larger trend soon moved in the opposite direction. Almohad power continued to rise and then to harden into a dominant force. The initial base established in the Algarve was expanded. Granada fell under Almohad control in 1154, and Almeria was recovered in 1157. The founding of Gibraltar in 1159 was not a symbolic gesture, but a strategic tool. It made it easier to transport troops and supplies, and to launch large-scale operations into Iberia. A full invasion followed in 1160. After the death of Abd al-Mumin in 1163, the tempo briefly slowed, but his successor, Yusuf I, resumed pressure with renewed energy. In the west, the Portuguese adventurer Geraldo the Fearless seized Badajoz and built a reputation as a frontier raider. But in 1169, Almohad forces drove him out. In the east, King Wolf's state faced sustained Almohad attacks through the 1160s. When he died in 1172, his political structure collapsed quickly, and by 1173, nearly all of al-Andalus was under Almohad control, aside from the Balearic Islands, which remained outside their grasp for a time. The Almohad Empire reached its high point in the last quarter of the 12th century. In 1191, they recaptured Alcácer do Sal, a key fortress guarding the southern approaches to Lisbon. In 1195, they inflicted a heavy defeat on Castile at Alarcos, the most serious Christian setback since Sagrajas, more than a century earlier. In 1196 and 1197, Almohad forces crossed the Tagus frontier and devastated territory near Madrid, even laying siege to the town briefly in 1197. In 1203, they absorbed the Balearic Islands, completing their control over the main remaining Muslim enclave beyond the peninsula's mainland. These reversals felt especially painful to Western Christians because they coincided with disasters in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1187, Saladin crushed the Crusader armies at Hattin and took Jerusalem. The Third Crusade, led by Richard of England, failed to retake the city. By the time Saladin died in 1194, the political strength of Middle Eastern Islam appeared greater than it had been in generations, and a century of Western crusading seemed to have achieved very little. In Iberia, Almohad's success was helped by the weakness and division of their opponents. Aragon and Catalonia had been joined in a federation in 1137, an arrangement that endured despite tensions. But the Western Christian kingdoms were unstable. Alfonso VII divided his realm between his sons, separating Leon and Castile, a split that would last for decades. Rivalries among Navarre, Castile, Leon, and Portugal became constant. Under these conditions, coordinated defense against a unified imperial enemy was extremely difficult. The political culture of the period was also marked by startling shifts of allegiance. One dramatic example involved Pedro Fernández de Castro, a powerful Castilian noble who quarrelled with Alfonso VIII and defected to the Almohads. He fought on the Muslim side at Alarcos. In the following year, the Almohad ruler Yaqub entrusted him with command of Muslim troops intended to cooperate with the King of Leon in an attack on Castile. The plan was executed with brutal efficiency. Yaqub devastated the Tagus Valley while Pedro Fernández ravaged the northern plains around Palencia. At the same time, Almohad diplomacy inflamed Navarre's border disputes with Castile, prompting Sancho VII of Navarre to invade from the north. Within a year of a defeat that shocked observers across Western Europe, Castile faced attacks from multiple directions. By a Muslim army, by a Christian neighbour, and by a close relative whose campaign depended on Muslim forces led by a renegade Castilian. Such actions scandalised religious opinion, and papal pressure for unity among Christian rulers intensified. Pope Celestine III, elderly but experienced, had already served as a papal envoy in Spain earlier in life and understood the region's dangers. He issued excommunications against those who undermined Christian cooperation, reaffirmed Spain's standing as a legitimate theatre of holy war, and sent envoys to force peace. His successor, Innocent III, continued the pressure. After prolonged negotiations, a general peace among the Christian kingdoms was reached in 1207. Meanwhile, the Almohads, focused on securing the Balearics, granted a series of short truces that unintentionally gave Castile time to recover and prepare. Castile's response culminated in the campaign of 1212. This was not a spontaneous raid, but a carefully organised offensive, shaped by political planning and religious mobilisation. Pope Innocent urged bishops in France to encourage knights to support the Castilian king. Public acts of prayer and fasting were held in Rome to frame the war as a sacred endeavour. Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada, the new Archbishop of Toledo, travelled through France recruiting warriors, especially from the southern regions. Troubadours reinforced the message in their songs, mixing spiritual rhetoric with the social ambitions and private dramas of aristocratic life. Forces assembled at Toledo in late May. Castilians and French contingents, later joined by armies from Aragon and Navarre. The coalition marched south. Many of the French soon abandoned the expedition, reportedly overwhelmed by the summer heat of Andalusia. The Almohad ruler, Muhammad, had used the time to prepare and positioned his army on the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa, near the Despeñaperros Pass, through the Sierra Morena, a strategic choke point on the road between central and southern Spain. The Almohads blocked the most direct route, forcing the Christian army toward a narrow canyon. But a local shepherd guided the allies through an alternative pass unknown to Almohad scouts. This allowed the coalition to reach a favourable position and camp without harassment. The battle took place on Monday, the 16th of July. Fighting was intense and costly, but the outcome was decisive. The Almohad army broke, Muhammad fled, and his standard was left behind. Alfonso later presented it to the religious foundation he had established at Las Huelgas near Burgos, where it remained as a visible trophy of victory. In a letter to Pope Innocent, the king emphasized the scale of the enemy and described how, for days after the battle, the Allied army used captured arrows and spears as fuel for cooking fires. So vast was the debris left on the field. The decades that followed transformed Iberia. Between Las Navas and the death of Fernando III in 1252, most of al-Andalus passed permanently into the hands of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal. This was not an effortless takeover. The process contained danger, reversals, and moments when the outcome was far from certain. Yet Christian morale rose steadily, reinforced by the weakening of Almohad power and the internal problems spreading through their empire. Almohad decline had multiple causes. The military shock of 1212 was severe, but it was not the only wound. The original spiritual program of Ibn Tumat faded as the empire matured into a dynasty. Early ideals had stressed religious virtue over bloodline, yet succession gradually became hereditary. Stories circulated about Abd al-Mu'min rejecting dynastic inheritance at first, insisting that leadership should be based on godliness rather than family, then later reversing his position. Whatever the exact truth, the effect was clear. A movement that had begun as a disciplined community dedicated to reform became a state ruled by a single lineage. This change widened the distance between rulers and subjects. Tribal divisions among Berber groups, never fully erased, returned with force. The leadership increasingly relied on outside military recruits, including Bedouin forces drawn from Algeria, echoing earlier patterns in Iberian history, where rulers imported soldiers to secure their power. These troops required payment, taxes increased, and in times of instability, mercenary forces became a destabilizing factor rather than a solution. New enemies also emerged within North Africa. The Banu Marine, pastoral groups living on the margins of Almohad authority in eastern Morocco, had never been fully absorbed by the empire. After Las Navas, they moved northward toward the Mediterranean in a sudden and ominous migration. From there, they began the wars that would eventually replace Almohad rule in Morocco. Almohad leaders responded with defensive measures that revealed their anxiety. Fortifications were strengthened, cities were reinforced, and new defensive structures were built, including major works in Seville designed to resist attack from the sea. The sense of insecurity was justified. Yusuf II died in 1224 in a freak accident, and the succession crisis that followed shattered centralized control. Authority in both North Africa and Iberia fractured, and regional commanders and local rulers began acting independently. This fragmentation created the opening that Christian rulers had long awaited. In the early 13th century, two kings in particular moved decisively: James I of Aragon and Fernando III of Castile. Alongside them stood Sancho II of Portugal, energetic and persistent, even if less visible in the sources. In Portugal, expansion south of Lisbon accelerated. Over a relatively short span, territories west of the Guadiana and south of the capital were incorporated into the Portuguese crown, culminating in the capture of key cities that fixed Portugal's borders in a form that would endure. In the eastern Mediterranean world of Iberia, Aragon's advance was shaped by both political ambition and maritime strength. James I, after years of internal disorder and noble rebellion, turned outward. the merchant families of Barcelona favoured a naval offensive, and the first target became the Balearic Islands. In 1229, a large fleet sailed for Majorca. Palma fell by the end of the year, and resistance was crushed in the months that followed. Minorca accepted subordination soon afterward, and further islands were taken in the next phase. These operations were not isolated raids. They were the foundation of a wider maritime presence that would later reach deep into the central Mediterranean. With secure sea routes and island bases, James pushed south along the coast toward Valencia. He combined negotiation with force, gradually tightening control over towns and countryside. Valencia, shaken by the political turmoil of the post-Almohad period, became the central prize. A long siege followed, supported by naval blockade that cut off relief from North Africa. In September 1238, the city surrendered and the Aragonese banner was raised. In the years that followed, additional towns surrendered one after another. By the time James died, he had dramatically expanded his realm and reshaped the balance of power along the Mediterranean shore. Castile's expansion under Fernando III was even larger in territorial scale. A key condition was the reunion of Leon and Castile in 1230, ending the division that had weakened Christian coordination for decades. Leon already possessed major conquest in Extremadura, including Cáceres, Mérida, and Badajoz, which extended Christian control far south toward the Guadiana. Fernando inherited this strengthened base and used it to drive deeper into Andalusi territory. Detailed accounts survive in contemporary chronicles, including one written by Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada, the Archbishop of Toledo, who combined political influence, administrative skill, and intellectual ambition. He became one of the most powerful churchmen of the Middle Ages in Iberia and played a decisive role in mobilizing religious support for Castile's southern campaigns. Under Fernando, conquest was not presented merely as opportunism, but increasingly framed as a sustained mission backed by institutions, propaganda, and the growing confidence of a society convinced that the balance of power had finally turned. The three main narrative sources of the age all bring their stories to a close with the capture of Córdoba in 1236. To those writers, the city's fall looked like the natural climax of Fernando III's career. In one sense, it was. Córdoba carried a weight of memory and symbolism that few places in Iberia could match. Yet the campaign that delivered it to Castile was not the result of a long, carefully staged plan. It began as an accident of war, triggered by initiative on the ground, and then amplified by a king willing to gamble. Córdoba at the time was unstable, its political order fractured in the same way that other Andalusi cities were fractured in these years. Into this uncertainty stepped a band of freelance Christian fighters, soldiers of fortune who operated on the edges of official armies. One winter night, under cover of darkness, they slipped into the city and seized a suburb. It was a small gain and a dangerous one. A foothold like this could easily be wiped out if the defenders reacted quickly and decisively. The raiders understood that their position would not survive without reinforcement, so they sent urgent messages to Fernando III asking him to come at once. The timing was unfavourable. It was January, and the weather was soaked and heavy with winter rain. The king was far away at Benavente, near the borders of Leon and Galicia, roughly 300 miles from Córdoba. Many rulers would have hesitated, judged the distance too great, the season too harsh, the risks too high. Fernando chose the opposite. Whether it was courage or recklessness depended on who later told the story, but the decision was made quickly. He gathered whatever forces he could, rode hard for the south, and reached the captured suburb in time to stabilize the situation. With the foothold secured, siege began. Reinforcements did not appear all at once. They arrived gradually from Castile, marching down in separate contingents as news spread that the king was personally committed to the operation. Meanwhile, a Muslim force from Seville moved toward Córdoba in an attempt to relieve the city, yet it stopped short of a direct attack. The siege tightened, pressure grew, and the defenders' options narrowed. On June 29th, the city surrendered. The transfer of sacred space followed immediately, in a way that made the conquest feel final. That same evening, the Bishop of Osma, Juan, who served as royal chancellor and is often linked to one of the contemporary histories, performed a formal rite to purify the main mosque and dedicate it as the Cathedral of Córdoba. On the next day, Fernando entered the city in ceremony, heard mass inside the newly consecrated building, and then held court in the nearby palace with his leading nobles and bishops around him. For more than 5 centuries, Córdoba had been a core centre of Islamic authority in Iberia, celebrated for power, scholarship, and prestige. Now, it stood under a Christian king's administration. Even the objects of memory were pulled into the narrative of reversal. The bells that had once been taken from the shrine of St. James, in the late 10th century, carried away as war trophies during Almanzor's campaigns, were now sent back towards Santiago de Compostela. Their return was meant to announce something larger than a single victory. It signalled a turning of the wheel, the undoing of an earlier humiliation, and the claim that history itself was being forced into a new direction. After Córdoba, the work was not finished. The next years were spent extending control across the surrounding countryside and pushing deeper into Andalusia. Towns, castles, and river routes had to be secured. Garrisons were planted. Supply lines had to function. Victory in a famous city meant little if the region around it remained hostile. Yet as these practical tasks continued, attention increasingly fixed on a prize even larger in scale and consequence: Seville. In the autumn of 1246, Fernando moved against Seville and began the siege. What followed revealed the changing character of war in the peninsula. Control of the sea and of navigable rivers could decide the fate of major cities. Seville's link to the outside world ran through the Guadalquivir. The river carried supplies, messages, and reinforcement, and it connected the city to surviving Islamic strongholds in the south. A floating bridge of boats and platforms spanned the water between Seville and the suburb of Triana, serving as a vital artery for movement and communication. As long as that bridge held, Seville was not fully cut off. Fernando understood that the siege would succeed only if the river could be dominated. For this, he relied on maritime expertise and private wealth. He turned to Ramon Boniface, a financier from Burgos, and tasked him with assembling a fleet drawn from the growing ports along the Biscayan coast. The ships arrived in the summer of 1247 and began, little by little, to gain control of the Guadalquivir. It was not a single dramatic moment at first, but a steady tightening of the net as river traffic was disrupted and the besieged city found the outside world harder to reach. The decisive act came the following spring. Boniface's sailors drove their ships into the pontoon bridge and smashed it apart, severing the last reliable connection between Seville and the wider Islamic network that might have sustained it. Once that link was broken, the outcome was no longer uncertain in a military sense. The question became how long the city could endure. The summer of 1248 brought extreme heat, and the siege turned into a slow crisis of survival. Both the defenders inside the walls and the besiegers outside suffered. Water became scarce, food supplies dwindled, and disease spread through crowded camps and exhausted neighbourhoods. Within the city, conditions deteriorated steadily. The strain ground down morale. The defenders could see that no relief was coming. the logic of endurance collapsed under the weight of hunger, thirst, and fear. When negotiations finally took shape, Fernando showed little flexibility. He had decided that Seville must not only be taken but held permanently, and he acted on the belief that lasting control required demographic change. The terms demanded that every Muslim inhabitant leave the city, carrying only what could be transported by hand. The intention was clear. Seville would be resettled as an overwhelmingly Christian city, so that it could not easily return to its previous political and cultural identity. The conditions were severe, but the city's position had become hopeless. On 23rd November, the terms were accepted, and the population was granted 1 month to depart. Fernando made his formal entry on 22nd December, 1248. Behind the narrow lines of celebrating soldiers stretched streets that felt emptied of their former life. Many buildings stood abandoned. The withdrawal had happened under pressure and exhaustion, and people on the road could not carry everything they owned. In the city, animals that had not been eaten during the siege scavenged among discarded bundles and broken possessions. Seville was taken, but it was taken at a cost that could be felt in the silence of emptied houses and the disruption of a society forced to move. The emotional meaning of these losses echoed beyond Christian chronicles. A later Andalusi poet, Arundi, composed an elegy that treated the fall of Seville not as an isolated event, but as part of a wider unravelling. His verses move from city to city as if asking the land itself to testify. What became of Murcia? Where is Játiva? What happened to Jaén, and what remains of Córdoba's learning? He describes Seville by its river, once associated with prosperity and gathering, now transformed. The poem frames the cities as pillars holding up the country, and it insists that when the pillars fall, the structure cannot stand. In Arundi's vision, even the physical features of worship become mourners. Ablution fountains are imagined as weeping. Prayer niches and pulpits are given voices of lament, even though they are made of stone and wood. Mosques become churches, and the soundscape changes as bells ring, where calls to prayer once shaped the air. The final warning is directed not at a single ruler, but at anyone who believes fortune will sleep forever. Fate, the poem insists, remains awake, and what happened to Seville is a message written in the ruins of certainty. Seville stood at the heart of Almohad Spain when the dynasty reached its strongest position in the late 12th century. It was more than an administrative centre. It was a showcase city, a place where the rulers of al-Andalus wanted to be seen, where authority could be staged in stone and ceremony. One of their most ambitious acts of public devotion was the rebuilding of the main mosque on a monumental scale. Almost all of that complex has vanished, yet one element still dominates the skyline: the great tower later known as the Giralda, raised around the year 1185. In the wider Islamic world, tall towers attached to mosques were not an ancient universal feature. They became more common over time, and in the Western Islamic lands they seem to have gained special momentum under Almohad rule. The Almohads used such towers as deliberate statements. Their religious program emphasized strict unity of belief and a highly visible, disciplined image of orthodoxy. Architecture became one of the tools that carried that message. Tinmal, the spiritual center associated with their early movement, had a tower. In Marrakesh, a huge tower rose beside the Kutubiyya Mosque under Abd al-Mumin. These projects were not simply about calling worshippers to prayer. They were meant to announce order, certainty, and dominance. The most ambitious of all was planned at Rabat, where construction began on a massive tower for the mosque of Hassan after the Almohad victory over Alfonso VIII at Alarcos in 1195. The project stalled when the ruler Yaqub died in 1199, and it was never completed. its unfinished bulk still stands as a kind of frozen moment in time, marking both the peak of Almohad confidence and the weakening that followed. These surviving monuments are the clearest reminders of Almohad patronage. Yet in many respects, the cultural brilliance of earlier centuries in Islamic Spain was difficult to match. The age of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Taifa courts had set an extraordinarily high standard in scholarship, literature, and courtly refinement. Under the Almoravids and Almohads, the overall level did not rise beyond that earlier world. Still, vitality did not disappear. Poetry retained force, and the voice of Arundi, mourning the loss of cities, shows that literary expression remained sharp and emotionally powerful. Scientific work also continued. Medical writing in particular remained active, with serious treatises produced and circulated among the educated elite. Philosophy, too, was alive, and under Almohad rule it gained a distinctive intensity. One window into that intellectual climate is a remarkable story written by Ibn Tufail, a physician who served the Almohad ruler, Yusuf I. He composed a narrative about a child named Hay, raised in complete isolation on a deserted island, nourished by a gazelle and left without teachers, books, or society. Through observation, reflection, and disciplined thought, Hay constructs a complete understanding of the world and arrives at a religious and philosophical vision on his own. Eventually another man arrives, Asal, who comes from a populated island shaped by formal religion and social customs. Asal seeks solitude for spiritual practice and finds instead a thinker who seems to have reached the same truths without revelation or tradition. When the two compare their ideas, they discover that their conclusions align. Full of confidence, they travel together to Asal's society, believing they can lift the community to a purer understanding. The outcome is not what they expect. The ruler and the people have little interest in the demanding worldview offered by two idealists. They reject the attempt to reform them. In outline, the story might sound like a dry lesson, but it is told with elegance and warmth, with a tone that invites the listener to keep going. The narrative became widely admired, not only in Islamic lands, but also in European translations centuries later. An English translation produced in the 17th century is often linked to the imaginative background of later European literature, and some have suggested that its themes helped shape the atmosphere in which stories of isolated islands and self-taught survival later flourished. The novel reflects a larger argument that animated many educated circles in 12th century Iberia: how reason and faith relate to one another, and how far philosophical inquiry can travel without colliding with religious authority. Ibn Tufail was not alone in wrestling with these questions. He also played a key role in bringing a younger figure to the attention of the Almohad court, a thinker whose name would echo across both Islamic and Christian intellectual history. That man was Ibn Rushd, known in Latin Europe as Averroes. Averroes came from Córdoba, from a family respected in legal circles. Several generations before him had gained prominence as jurists, and he inherited both education and expectation. He grew up during years of political upheaval when Almoravid control in al-Andalus was weakening and new power was arriving from North Africa. When the Almohads took Córdoba in 1148, he was a young man, and early on he supported the new regime. Through Ibn Tufail's patronage, he entered court circles in the middle of the century and moved into public life at the intersection of scholarship, law, and power. He served as a religious judge in major cities, including Seville and Córdoba, and he held authority over cases where law and doctrine mattered deeply. He also became physician and advisor to Almohad rulers, trusted enough to work close to the centre of decision-making. Then, in a sudden reversal that remains difficult to explain in detail, He lost favour and was exiled in 1195, likely the result of court tensions that can only be guessed at now. Not long before his death in 1198, he was restored. Despite heavy official responsibilities, Averroes wrote relentlessly. He belongs to that rare category of individuals who combine many skills without losing depth. He produced medical work grounded in long practice and experience, assembling broad knowledge into a structured compendium. He engaged with astronomy and observation, and his intellectual life ranged widely across the fields, studied by learned people of his day. Yet his enduring reputation rests most strongly on philosophy, especially his deep engagement with Aristotle. Averroes treated Aristotle not as a distant curiosity, but as a central guide to how the world could be understood. He wrote explanations and commentaries on nearly everything he could access, from logic and ethics to biology and natural phenomena, shaping Aristotle's writings into a framework his own society could debate. He also addressed parts of Plato's work, including political ideas that pushed beyond simple moral instruction. For him, Aristotle represented an extraordinary achievement of human thought, a model of disciplined reasoning. Yet that admiration created tension. Islam is rooted in revelation, in divine speech communicated through the prophet and recorded in sacred scripture. For a devout judge and court scholar, the authority of revelation could not be treated lightly. Aristotle, by contrast, offered a method that seemed to make divine reference unnecessary for many questions. The world could be explained through observation, analysis, and inference, step by step, by the human mind. This was not a purely academic puzzle. It touched the foundations of authority, education, and legitimacy. Averroes did not try to destroy religion in the name of reason. He tried to map the boundary and explore whether the two could be reconciled. One of his best-known themes was the possibility of agreement between philosophical inquiry and religious truth. His writings examine how scriptural language works, how interpretation should be handled, and whether different levels of understanding might be appropriate for different audiences. He did not end the argument, and no one ever does. But he widened the space in which the argument could happen, offering methods, distinctions, and a bold confidence that inquiry itself was not a betrayal of faith. The afterlife of his thought became enormous in Christian Europe. As Latin scholars in the 13th and 14th centuries absorbed Greek philosophy through Arabic channels, Aristotle arrived as a disruptive force in universities and monastic schools. European theologians and philosophers faced the same friction between reasoned explanation and revealed doctrine. In that debate, Averroes became indispensable. He was treated as the great interpreter of Aristotle, the voice that could guide readers through difficult texts. Writers across Europe cited him constantly, sometimes to borrow his insights, sometimes to argue against him, but always to take him seriously. Even those who sought to build a Christian synthesis between reason and revelation made frequent use of his work because his commentaries clarified what had to be answered. These intellectual achievements and architectural monuments offer one view of the Almohad era. Yet as the 12th and 13th centuries progressed, the story of Islamic Spain increasingly became something else as well. The story of Muslim communities living under Christian rulers in expanding kingdoms. The political map was changing. Areas once governed by Islamic states were absorbed into Christian monarchies, and large numbers of Muslims remained behind as conquered subjects rather than emigrating or being expelled. Modern discussions often describe this situation with a term that implies coexistence and shared life. It can suggest a calm, balanced society where cultural differences are accepted with ease. The reality was more complicated. multi-faith societies had existed before in Iberia, during the height of the caliphate and under the Taifa rulers. They also existed elsewhere in medieval Europe, including Norman Sicily and the Crusader states in the eastern Mediterranean. Iberia was not the only place where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in proximity, traded, argued, and sometimes collaborated. What does stand out is that Iberian coexistence lasted longer than most comparable experiments, continuing even as broader European culture shifted toward tighter boundaries and harsher intolerance of difference. Long duration did not guarantee harmony. The language of rulers and intellectuals on both sides could be openly hostile. Christian kings sometimes described Muslims in ways that framed them as permanently untrustworthy, and Muslim scholars sometimes warned believers not to adopt Christian habits or customs. Whether such statements reflect ordinary daily relations or mainly reveal elite ideology is difficult to measure. Still, such voices show that the emotional climate could be charged and defensive even when communities lived side by side. What happened when a town came under Christian rule varied widely. The worst outcomes included killings during a capture, usually less a planned extermination than a collapse of discipline during the chaos of assault. Medieval armies were volatile. Violence could erupt suddenly, and in the confusion of sack and street fighting, people died who were not targeted for religion alone. Sometimes, even local Christians suffered. In other cases, fire and panic created deaths that might not have been intended, and later, sources leave uncertainty about what commanders knew in the moment. Yet large-scale slaughter was rarely in anyone's interest. People were valuable. Captives could be exchanged, ransomed, or enslaved. Slavery remained an accepted institution in Iberia long after it was fading in many parts of Western Europe. Muslims taken in war were used as labour, just as Christians captured in Muslim campaigns could be forced into work in North Africa. Entire communities could be sold after conquest, with only the wealthy able to buy their freedom or secure passage abroad. Evidence from monastic records shows enslaved Muslims living far from the front lines, working as weavers, cobblers, and blacksmiths in religious communities that owned human beings as property. These were not isolated exceptions, but part of a broader social system. Alongside slavery, there was another path: remaining in place under new rulers. Islamic legal tradition contained opinions that encouraged believers to leave lands governed by non-Muslims, and in some cases people did depart, either by choice or under pressure. Other times, as in the forced evacuation of Seville, departure was imposed. But many stayed. They became Muslim subjects living under Christian authority, permitted to remain by agreement, by necessity, or because rulers saw advantage in keeping productive communities in place. Christian governments often formalized arrangements for these populations through written local rules, issued after conquest. These documents set out rights, taxes, obligations, and limits. In some places, Muslims were promised their property, freedom of worship, and internal leadership under their own legal traditions. Agreements could include freedom of movement and permission to trade. Taxes were imposed in the same way taxes were imposed on everyone, though the details could vary. Rules designed for one town were often copied and reused in others, spreading across regions as conquerors expanded. But the existence of protective rules did not mean daily life was equal. These texts show both intention and anxiety. Some clauses reveal fear of reprisals, as if authorities worried that events in Muslim lands might spark revenge against Muslims living under Christian rule. Other provisions point to routine discrimination. Muslims often managed their own communal affairs but had little influence over the wider municipal government. In some cities they lived in separate quarters, sometimes by choice, sometimes by pressure, sometimes behind walls built to keep populations apart. In court disputes between Muslims and Christians, procedures often favoured Christians. Tribunals could be composed entirely of Christian officials. Requirements for sworn support in legal conflicts could be structured in ways that made it easier for Christian litigants to find the necessary backing. Even punishments for crimes could reflect unequal valuation, with penalties for harming Muslims sometimes set lower than penalties for harming Christians. In practice, then, coexistence was a shifting field rather than a stable ideal. It involved negotiation, pressure, legal compromise, cultural distance, and economic need. People lived together, traded and worked, but also feared betrayal, suspected one another, and operated within systems that marked one community as dominant and another as subordinate. The story of the later medieval peninsula is filled with these contradictions. Grand monuments of power and scholarship on one side, and on the other, the everyday realities of conquest, survival, and unequal life under changing flags. In everyday life, the line between Muslim and Christian communities had never been invisible. Even in times of relative calm, people could feel the difference in the most personal routines. What families ate, how they washed, how they married, how they marked purity and privacy. When Christian rule expanded into former Andalusi territories, the new municipal rules did not soften these boundaries. More often, they sharpened them. City law during the conquest era tended to formalize separation and turn customs into enforced distance. Public bathhouses, for example, often operated on a strict schedule that kept communities apart, assigning different days to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Households were restricted too. Christian families were typically forbidden to hire Muslim or Jewish women as wet nurses or childminders, reflecting a fear that intimacy inside the home could blur religious identity. Dress became another visible marker. Certain colours, fabrics, or styles were banned for Muslims living under Christian authority, a way of making difference readable on the street. The sharpest boundary of all concerned sexuality across the divide. Relations between a Muslim man and a Christian woman could bring extreme punishment, and the penalties described in law were designed to terrify as much as to punish. In many legal traditions of the period, a Muslim man involved with a Christian woman faced death by stoning, though some texts made distinctions depending on circumstances and repeated offences. The message was clear. Crossing that line was treated not as a private act, but as a public threat to communal order. Religious life was regulated in a similarly hard way. Muslim communities were often allowed to continue worship, but any attempt to spread Islam or publicly advocate conversion was strictly prohibited. This mirrored earlier restrictions imposed on Christians living under Muslim rule, where active missionary preaching could also be forbidden. Under Christian kings, conversion in the opposite direction was treated as treason to the faith. In both Aragon and Castile, a Christian who adopted Islam could face execution. At the same time, Muslims were compelled to show respect toward Christian rituals in public space. They might be required to stop working on Christian holy days. Rules could demand physical gestures of deference during processions, including kneeling as clergy carried the Eucharist through the streets. Laws even attempted to police speech. A Muslim who insulted central Christian sacred figures could be publicly whipped at first, with harsher mutilating punishment threatened for repeat offences. Economic pressure was built into the system as well. Muslims who acquired land from Christians could be required to pay church tithes on that property, binding them financially to an institution they did not belong to. The landscape of worship also changed. Conquerors regularly converted major mosques into churches. Smaller neighbourhood mosques sometimes survived, but taking over the principal mosque struck at a community's ability to gather as one body. Friday prayer, the great weekly act of public cohesion, became harder to maintain without a central space large enough to hold the whole community. This was one reason the Great Mosque of Córdoba still stands today, in altered form. It survived because it was repurposed, not because it was protected as a monument. Were Muslims forced into baptism in large numbers? In general, systematic forced conversion does not appear to have been the standard policy. Moral language existed that praised persuasion over coercion. Rulers and churchmen could echo an ideal that conversion should come through preaching and example rather than fear. Yet ideals on parchment did not always become enforceable practice, and even major legal compilations that spoke in humane tones did not always become binding law. Still, the broader pattern suggests that Christian authorities often preferred Muslims to remain as a taxable, regulated labour force, rather than to be driven into mass baptism that would create new complications of status and rights. Conversions nevertheless happened, sometimes framed as miracles. Chronicles tell stories of dramatic healings in cathedrals that were followed by a wave of baptisms among Jews and Muslims who witnessed them. Later, royal collections of devotional poetry also included narratives in which the Virgin Mary's intervention, such as the revival of a child, was said to lead a Muslim mother to embrace Christianity. Not all incentives were spiritual. In some places, freedom from slavery was offered to those who converted. But even that created conflict. Owners feared losing valuable property if enslaved people gained freedom through baptism. And church authorities sometimes complained that owners blocked conversions to protect their profits. Policies could shift under pressure, especially in newly conquered regions, where slaves were an essential labour resource and landowners resisted any rule that weakened their control. The strongest missionary energy often arrived from outside Iberia. Visitors from Northern Europe sometimes reacted with outrage to any sign of accommodation between Christians and Muslims, believing confrontation to be the only proper stance. That same mindset persisted into later centuries, feeding pressure on local rulers and clergy to tighten boundaries and reduce ambiguity. Language, like religion, became a battlefield of identity. Arabic had not been spoken only by Muslims. Many Christians under Muslim rule, and even after conquest, had used Arabic as an everyday language. This created a long, messy transition in cities changing hands. Evidence from tombstones and legal documents reveals how mixed the cultural reality could be. A Christian might be buried in a church with a Latin epitaph, yet the same stone could carry an Arabic inscription using familiar Islamic phrases of mercy and the afterlife. It is a strange image. Christian identity asserted in one script, Islamic funerary language flowing around it like a second skin. Documents show similar hybridity. A family could appear fully Christian by name and parish, while still using Arabic in legal notes and speaking in expressions common in Islamic culture. In cities like Toledo, hundreds of records preserve Arabic signatures or Arabic additions appended to Latin charters, suggesting that Arabic remained useful and meaningful in daily transactions for generations. Over time, Arabic words flowed into the emerging Romance languages of the peninsula. Castilian, Portuguese, and Catalan absorbed thousands of terms connected to agriculture, crafts, trade, administration, and everyday objects. Yet Arabic, as a living written language, gradually weakened within many Muslim communities under Christian rule. By the 15th century, some Muslim scholars chose to write in Islamic guidance in Castilian because so few of their audience could read Arabic fluently. In some regions, however, Arabic lasted far longer. The decline was uneven. The distribution of Muslim communities under Christian rule was uneven as well. It is easy to imagine a simple gradient with few Muslims in the north and many in the south, but the reality was patchier. In Navarre, for instance, Tudela contained a substantial Muslim population. In Aragon, Muslims may have formed a significant fraction of the population in the later Middle Ages, but many lived in scattered rural settlements rather than in large urban concentrations, and assimilation progressed more rapidly. In Catalonia, Muslims were few outside certain towns. Valencia was the great exception within the Aragonese realms. The city itself saw expulsion after conquest, yet the surrounding countryside remained overwhelmingly Muslim for centuries, and both Arabic and Islamic practice retained strength there into the early modern period. In Old Castile, Leon, and northern Portugal, free Muslim communities were rare, and many Muslims present were enslaved. In towns between the Duero and the Tagus, places like Avila, Segovia, Toledo, and Talavera, there were smaller but noticeable Muslim populations. South of the Tagus, much land was thinly settled and held in large estates, often associated with military institutions. Here, Muslims might survive as poor rural labourers or as groups of enslaved workers. In Andalusia, the picture shifted again. Towns were larger and denser, and Muslim communities, though altered by conquest and migration, often remained within urban life. Administrative records from several Andalusian cities help trace what happened after conquest. Property registers reveal the redistribution of houses and fields and the slow return of some Muslims to cities that had been emptied. In Seville, despite the harsh evacuation, Muslims drifted back with royal encouragement because settlers were needed, especially skilled craftspeople who could keep an economy functioning. A record from the mid-13th century can casually place a property between the homes of artisans with Muslim names, showing that practical necessity could soften absolute exclusion even after dramatic expulsions. Those who had the means often chose to leave. Many members of the old Muslim elite emigrated to North Africa or to the remaining Muslim kingdom of Granada. That departure changed the character of the communities that stayed. What remained was often a society without its leadership class, a population stripped of wealth and influence. Rebellions later erupted in different regions, and when they failed, further expulsions and migrations followed. Conquerors used revolts as justification to tighten restrictions and to revise earlier surrender agreements. In Valencia, free Muslim peasants were pushed into heavier obligations under local lords, lowering their status and living standards. Over time, the result could look like a subculture carrying a long injury, still alive, still skilled, but constrained and vulnerable. Even so, the scene should not be painted as pure misery, without exception. Much of the evidence for discrimination comes from laws describing how society was supposed to function, not necessarily how it always worked. Real life had more leakage across boundaries than the rules preferred. Church councils in the early 14th century complained that Christians were bringing Muslim friends to Mass. Clerics also protested that Muslim musicians were being hired to play inside churches during long night vigils to keep people awake and ease the boredom. These details reveal a social world more flexible than legal texts suggest, a world where friendship and entertainment could cut across official hostility. In social terms, however, Muslim communities under Christian rule were often pushed toward lower status. In rural settings, many worked as small farmers, gardeners, shepherds. In towns, they frequently held skilled trades: pottery, carpentry, textile work, leatherwork, masonry, plasterwork, metalwork, shipbuilding, bookbinding. They were not always unskilled labourers. In some fields, they were highly valued technicians. Famous paper production, metal casting, and fine ceramics carried their imprint. The most visible legacy is architectural. Brickwork, geometric ornament, intricate patterned surfaces in stucco and wood became associated with Muslim artisans working in Christian territories. Fortresses and churches could carry decorative languages that clearly descended from Islamic design traditions, adapted to new patrons and new settings. This is the core contradiction of the period. Conquerors could act with both restraint and harshness, sometimes within the same decade, sometimes within the same city. There was tolerance in the sense of allowing worship and permitting communities to remain. There was persecution in the sense of social separation, legal inequality, and periodic violence. Instead of turning this into a simple moral verdict, the deeper question is why the mixture persisted. A major part of the answer lies in settlement. Conquest did not secure land by itself. A kingdom held territory only if it could populate it, farm it, tax it, defend it, and rebuild it. Earlier experience had taught Christian rulers a hard lesson. Gains could be lost if there were not enough settlers to consolidate them. North African dynasties had rolled back earlier Christian conquests precisely because frontier territories had not yet been filled with stable populations loyal to the new regime. As long as the possibility of a renewed Islamic offensive from across the straits remained real, encouraging settlement became the main peacetime obsession of rulers, nobles, bishops, and administrators. The scale of the challenge was immense. Aragon expanded dramatically in the 12th century, and then again in the 13th. Castile, once fixed at the Tagus frontier, pushed within a century down toward the straits. Populations had to be moved, towns rebuilt, fields put under cultivation, fortresses garrisoned. In the early phases of Christian expansion, colonists came from the far north of Iberia. Mountain regions that seem remote today were then densely peopled, and land hunger drove families down into plains and river valleys. Place names still preserve traces of those movements. Over time, that northern supply could not meet the demand, and rulers looked beyond the Pyrenees. From the late 11th century and through much of the 12th, migrants arrived from across Europe, especially from what is now France. Some came as warriors, others as clergy, craftsmen, merchants, or settlers seeking land and opportunity. Italians were drawn by commerce. Genoese entrepreneurs followed military ventures with permanent business presence, opening offices in newly conquered cities and exploring sea routes along the Atlantic. The same period saw settlers arriving from the English world. Some appear in records around Tarragona and Tortosa, attached to frontier defence and reconstruction. Individual careers can be traced. A foreign knight who gains property, invests in public works, lends money to local elites, and eventually ends life in a monastery, leaving documents that reveal a small network of compatriots nearby. Such stories show how Iberian expansion was tied to wider European movements of people and capital. Resettlement was not only lay, it was religious as well. New monasteries were planted in difficult landscapes, expected to cultivate land and anchor control. Reform orders were favoured because they accepted hardship and had strong organisational discipline. Later, urban preaching orders were well suited to the spiritual occupation of newly conquered cities, where new parishes, new churches, and new moral frameworks had to be imposed on complex populations. For a time, Europe's overall population growth fed this movement. there were settlers available, even if they never seemed enough. Then the 14th century brought demographic catastrophe. Famine years, then the Black Death, followed by recurring outbreaks. The flow of settlers slowed. Some towns remained thinly populated for generations after conquest. Some farmland reverted to emptiness, and stayed that way for centuries. Charters from the later Middle Ages sometimes read like desperate recruitment advertisements, offering refuge even to criminals in order to fill a strategic town with bodies capable of defending it. Seen from a distance, the treatment of Muslim communities under Christian rule becomes easier to understand, though not easier to judge. Rules tightened separation to protect identity and dominance, yet rulers also depended on Muslim labour, skills, and local knowledge to keep conquered territories functioning. Fear and necessity pulled in opposite directions. That tension shaped daily life for centuries, producing a world where boundaries were enforced on paper, crossed in practice, and constantly renegotiated in the streets, the markets, the courts, and the workshops of medieval Iberia. Seen against the enormous pressure to people and secure newly conquered land, it becomes clearer why Christian rulers often preferred Muslim communities to remain where they were. Keeping experienced farmers, craftsmen, and local labour in place could make the difference between a frontier that held and a frontier that slipped away. In some regions, this strategy worked. In the Valencian countryside, many Muslim villagers stayed and continued to cultivate the land, forming the backbone of rural production for generations. In much of Castile and Portugal, however, the pattern was different. Large areas emptied out or thinned dramatically, whether through flight, expulsion, later unrest, or the slow grinding discouragement of life under new lords. Where people were fewer, the landscape shifted toward an economy that needed bodies far less than crops did. Into that space moved animals, especially sheep. Grazing requires wide land more than dense settlement, and the great open plains between the Tagus and the Guadalquivir offered something pastoralists prized: winter grass. That southern zone made it possible to build a powerful system of seasonal migration. Each year, flocks could winter in places like La Mancha and Extremadura, then be driven north along established droving routes to summer pastures near Avila, Soria, or Teruel. Those long corridors across the peninsula became economic arteries, and the herds became moving capital. The military orders were among the biggest winners of this transformation. They accumulated huge southern estates and began to operate less like purely religious brotherhoods and more like territorial corporations. Some holdings reached astonishing sizes and their flocks rose into the millions. Around the middle of the 13th century, a new kind of sheep, the merino, spread through Iberia. It thrived in dry conditions and produced wool of unusually high quality. With that advantage, ranching interests organized to protect themselves, forming powerful institutions that defended grazing rights, migration routes, and legal privileges. Wool became the engine. First, it fed local weaving centers. Then, it flowed outward into the major textile regions of Europe. Merchants and shippers, including a strong Genoese presence, were ready to move the annual clip to distant looms in cities such as Florence and Bruges. Over time, wool exports became one of the peninsula's most enduring sources of wealth. Resettlement was not only about bodies and land. Another kind of colonization unfolded at the same time, one that took place in libraries, schools, and workshops of translation. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Western scholars gained access to the scientific and philosophical learning preserved and expanded in the Arabic-speaking world, and they carried it into Latin, the shared language of European scholarship. This transfer was one of the major turning points in intellectual history. Centuries earlier, as Islamic empires expanded into the old centres of the Eastern Mediterranean and Persia, they inherited vast stores of ancient knowledge. Much of what attracted sustained attention was practical and analytical. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, optics, and philosophy. Between roughly the 8th and the early 10th centuries, a huge body of texts was translated into Arabic, and then worked on, corrected, and improved by scholars who added new observations and methods. This was not a static inheritance. It was refined and enlarged, sometimes incorporating ideas that had travelled from as far away as India and China. Over time, that learning reached the westernmost Islamic lands, including al-Andalus, where it became part of an advanced intellectual environment. Early medieval Western Europe, by contrast, had little comparable infrastructure for scientific study. But curiosity and need eventually created points of contact. One early figure often placed at the beginning of this story is a French scholar who travelled to Spain in the 10th century and returned north with a reputation for mathematical teaching that seemed almost exotic in his world. His letters show a hunger for specialised manuals and techniques coming out of Iberian circles. The details can be elusive, but the larger direction is clear. Methods of calculation were crossing borders, and they were transforming what European administrators and builders could do. The key idea behind those new methods was place value, a simple principle with revolutionary consequences. Medieval people did not use an abacus the way modern children do, with a standing frame and brightly coloured beads. The older abacus was more like a ruled surface, sometimes a board, sometimes a slate, sometimes even a tray of sand divided into columns. Markers could be shifted from one column to another so that a symbol's meaning changed with its position. Units, tens, hundreds, thousands. This seems obvious now. In the mathematical culture of 10th century Europe, it was liberating. It made exact calculation faster and more reliable, which mattered far beyond classrooms. It shaped accounting, tax audits, and the growing complexity of royal government. It helped make large-scale building feasible with confidence, because ambitious architecture depends on numerical understanding of weight, balance, and thrust. Even the vocabulary of administration remembered the tool. The famous English financial office, later called the Exchequer, took its name from the checked counting surface used for calculations, where counters were moved across a grid during audits. Alongside these mathematical techniques came individuals who carried broader scientific knowledge across borders. A striking example is a Jewish scholar from Iberia who converted to Christianity in the early 12th century, adopted a new name, and later appears in England as a royal physician. He worked with astronomy, medicine, and calculation, and he helped translate technical material into Latin. Around the same time, other scholars in England were experimenting with instruments such as the astrolabe and producing treatises that gathered Arabic learning into a form a Latin reader could use. Some of these men moved within courtly and governmental circles, which mattered because rulers needed skilled minds, doctors, accountants, engineers, and advisors who claimed insight into the heavens and the future. There were two main gateways through which Latin Europe could access the Greco-Arabic tradition. One was the Christian kingdoms of Spain, especially cities where Arabic books were available and where bilingual communities still existed. The other was the Norman world of southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek texts and Arabic texts could both be encountered. In Italy, many translations were made directly from Greek into Latin. In Spain, translation more commonly moved from Arabic into Latin, including Arabic versions of ancient Greek works, and, crucially, the Arabic commentaries that Islamic philosophers had written on them. Aristotle is a good example. Some Latin scholars translated him from Greek, while others in Iberia focused on translating the explanations and interpretations that had grown up around Aristotle in the Islamic world, including those associated with figures like Averroes. This translation movement was not a single organised project. It was messy, competitive, and sometimes duplicated. Different scholars worked in different places, sometimes unaware of one another. Major works could be translated twice from different source languages within the same generation. Manuscripts were often poorly copied. Dates and authorship could be unclear, and Arabic technical terms were mangled into strange Latin spellings. For modern historians, it becomes a puzzle of reconstruction. But for medieval Europe, the overall effect mattered more than the chaos, a flood of new tools for understanding the world. In Spain, one of the most productive translators was an Italian who settled in Toledo in the mid-12th century and stayed for decades. He arrived because he wanted a particular astronomy text that he could not find in Latin, and he remained because Toledo's libraries contained an abundance of Arabic works across many disciplines. He learned Arabic, translated, relentlessly, and left behind a catalogue that shows the priorities of the age: medicine, astronomy and astrology, mathematics and optics, philosophy and logic. Accounts of his working methods suggest collaboration across linguistic lines. An assistant would interpret the Arabic text orally into the local vernacular, and the translator would render it into Latin. The result was not simply a private hobby. It was a pipeline by which Arabic scientific literature became accessible to Latin readers across Europe. Other translators moved between Iberia and the wider European stage. One scholar associated with the intellectual environment of Toledo later travelled to Italy and entered the orbit of the Emperor Frederick II, a ruler famed for curiosity about the natural world. At that court, the line between scholarship and prestige was thin. Translators became astrologers, advisors, and public intellectuals. Stories of their careers were embellished with dramatic anecdotes about predictions and fate. But behind the legend lies a real social fact. Technical knowledge could open doors into the highest circles of power. In the later 13th century, royal patronage in Iberia produced a different kind of intellectual project. A Castilian king gathered teams to compile, translate, and write works on astronomy, astrology, law, history, and literature, often drawing on Arabic models. Much of this output was created in the local vernacular rather than in Latin. That choice made it influential inside the peninsula but less visible beyond it. By the time these works appeared, much of Latin Europe had already absorbed the crucial foundations of Greco-Arabic learning. The great question was no longer how to get the books, but what to do with them. In philosophy, the pressure point was Aristotle. His method encouraged people to examine nature through observation and reason, which could feel unsettling in a religious culture built on revelation and authority. University controversies flared, and for a time some tried to restrict access to certain texts. Eventually, major thinkers in Western Europe built systems that attempted to reconcile reason with faith. The argument was not only theoretical, it influenced how people approached medicine, architecture, government finance, and the study of the natural world. A slow change in attitude can be traced. Nature was no longer treated only as a symbolic creation to be read through scripture. It became something to be investigated through measurement and experiment. In that shift, the foundations laid by translations from Arabic and Greek proved decisive. Later, scientific revolutions did not appear out of nowhere. They were built on centuries of accumulated tools and habits of thought. Given how eagerly Latin scholars borrowed secular knowledge from Arabic texts, it is tempting to expect a parallel curiosity about Islamic religious belief. In reality, sustained interest in understanding Islam as a faith remained limited, though there were a few revealing episodes. In the mid-12th century, the head of a major monastic network in France visited Spain and encountered scholars who were already translating Arabic scientific works. He persuaded them to translate Islamic religious text as well, including the Quran, producing the first major Quran translation into a Western language. On the surface, this might look like openness. Yet the motive was not dialogue. The project was designed to support polemic. The goal was to attack Islam more effectively by quoting it accurately, not to learn from it. Even the titles chosen for these polemical works made that intention obvious. For a long time, this early Quran translation circulated only in narrow circles. A later translator in Toledo, working at the start of the 13th century, produced another Quran translation and acted as if he were doing something unprecedented. That detail matters because it suggests that the earlier effort had left little lasting trace in scholarly memory. The second translation was often more literal, sometimes less elegant, and precisely because of that, it could be a sharper tool for someone who wanted to dissect Islamic belief line by line. Still, circulation remained limited. These translations appear at a moment when the military struggle in Iberia was intensifying and when church leaders were thinking about more than battle. Alongside crusading ideals, there emerged, in some circles, a renewed emphasis on mission. Preaching Christianity to Muslims, redeeming captives, training clergy who could move across language barriers. Some bishops dreamed of resigning their posts to become missionaries. Reformers debated whether preaching against heresy at home should take priority over mission abroad. The same era produced dramatic gestures such as a famous saint preaching to the Sultan in Egypt and religious rules that encouraged brothers to undertake missions among Muslims. There were also reckless attempts to preach in Islamic cities, sometimes ending in martyrdom. All of this required language skills. Popes instructed Iberian church leaders to send priests who knew both Latin and Arabic to serve Christians living in Islamic lands, including captives. New religious orders formed with the specific purpose of ransoming prisoners, and their practical work stretched across centuries, sometimes reaching into the early modern world. Royal policy also responded to the need for interpreters. In the mid-13th century, schools teaching both Latin and Arabic were founded in Seville, and the lack of explanation in the surviving records leaves motives open. Such training could serve missionaries, but it could just as easily serve administration and diplomacy in a society where Arabic remained essential for dealing with Muslim subjects, trade networks, and frontier negotiations. Certain church figures tied Arabic learning explicitly to mission. They founded schools in Mediterranean cities, produced vocabularies and tools for students, and wrote polemical works aimed at refutation. One famous Majorcan thinker devoted years to learning Arabic and established a training center for missionaries. Late in life, he lobbied for university programs in Eastern languages across Europe. Stories about his career are filled with intensity and contradiction. Visionary ambition mixed with harshness toward the Muslim people closest to him. One anecdote captures that contradiction in a raw way. A Christian intellectual who wanted Arabic instruction purchased a Muslim slave as a teacher. The relationship functioned until conflict erupted, violence followed, and the enslaved man attempted revenge. The story ends with the slave dead in prison and the master relieved that the crisis had resolved itself without a formal execution ordered by his hand. It is an unsettling scene, and it fits the wider reality of convivencia better than any romantic slogan. Coexistence in medieval Iberia was not a simple story of harmony, and it was not a simple story of persecution. It was a long, improvised compromise shaped by labour needs, economic advantage, religious anxiety, and the constant pressure of frontier war. Even intellectual exchange, so often celebrated as a bridge between worlds, could grow out of motives that ranged from admiration and curiosity to fear, domination, and the desire to defeat an opponent with his own words. By the middle of the 13th century, most of the Iberian Peninsula had passed under the authority of the Christian crowns of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal. One Muslim-ruled state, however, remained. In the political vacuum created by the collapse of Almohad power during the 1220s and 1230s, a local leader named Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr succeeded in carving out an independent principality. From 1237 onward, this state was centred on Granada, and his dynasty would later be known as the Nasrids. Within a decade, the territory of the Emirate had assumed the form it would largely retain until its end in 1492. A narrow stretch of land running from the Mediterranean coast near Almeria down toward the Straits of Gibraltar, rarely extending far inland. Its political position was also settled early. After surrendering the city of Jaén in 1246, the ruler of Granada accepted vassalage to the King of Castile and agreed to pay an annual tribute that consumed a vast portion of his revenues. From that point onward, Granada existed as a client state, formally independent but permanently subordinate, a relationship that endured for nearly 2.5 centuries. From the outset, Granada's survival was precarious. Economically, the emirate was weak. Its territory was largely mountainous and unsuited to large-scale grain cultivation. Food production was insufficient to support the population, forcing the import of cereals and olive oil from North Africa. In exchange, Granada exported high-value products such as sugar, dried fruits, almonds, and above all silk, which gained an international reputation. Much of this trade passed through the hands of foreign merchants, especially from Genoa, whose ships dominated Mediterranean commerce. Dependence on imports and foreign carriers made the emirate vulnerable to external pressure and fluctuations in trade. Politically, power within Granada was fragmented. Outside a handful of major towns, society remained rural and strongly shaped by tribal and lineage loyalties. Authority rested less on centralized institutions than on local elites, rival families, and regional strongmen. The ruler's position depended on constant negotiation, alliance building, bribery, and intimidation. Maintaining stability required exceptional political skill. For much of the 14th century, Nasrid rulers managed this balancing act with some success. After about 1400, however, internal rivalries intensified, plunging the emirate into near-continuous civil strife. The politics of 15th century Granada became a maze of shifting factions and betrayals, weakening the state from within. Granada's dependence on Castile further undermined its legitimacy. Under Islamic law, a Muslim ruler was not supposed to submit to Christian overlordship. Yet, Granada's survival depended precisely on such submission. Tribute payments forced rulers to impose heavy taxes that exceeded traditional norms, fueling popular resentment and giving religious scholars grounds for criticism. Isolation from the wider Islamic world, the influx of Muslim refugees from conquered Christian territories, and the recruitment of fiercely independent Berber warriors from North Africa all contributed to a tense and defensive social atmosphere. Granada lived with a constant sense of siege, both physical and psychological. Despite these disadvantages, the emirate endured. One reason was its formidable system of defence. Along its northern and western borders, a dense chain of castles was constructed, especially during the reign of Muhammad II in the late 13th century. These fortifications stood only a few miles apart and were supported by well-maintained city walls and an extraordinary number of watchtowers spread across the countryside. These towers functioned as early warning posts and local strongpoints in times of attack. Thousands were built, and many still dot the landscape today. Granada also maintained capable armies, particularly skilled light cavalry recruited from North Africa. These fast-moving horsemen were highly effective in raids and skirmishes, and contemporary Christian observers acknowledged their tactical advantages. Granada could also, at times, rely on help from across the sea. In Morocco, a powerful dynasty emerged that filled the vacuum left by the Almohads. During its peak in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, this North African power intervened repeatedly in Iberian affairs. On several occasions, it sent armies to support Granada or to pursue its own interests in the peninsula. These interventions could be decisive, defeating Christian forces and extracting vast amounts of booty before withdrawing. For a time, North African strongholds on the European side of the Straits provided forward bases. Eventually, Christian advances rolled these back, but for over a century, such assistance played a major role in Granada's survival. Alliances, however, were never straightforward. Political rivalries among Christian rulers sometimes led Muslim powers to support one faction against another. At times, North African forces and Granadan rulers found themselves backing opposing Christian claimants, turning the peninsula into a chessboard of shifting loyalties. Navigating this landscape required diplomatic agility. Nasrid rulers constantly sought to exploit divisions among their neighbours, while guarding against overdependence on external allies. Chance also played its part. In the mid-14th century, a major Castilian campaign was abruptly halted when plague struck the besieging army and claimed the king himself. Later in the century, Castile's attention was repeatedly diverted by internal conflict, wars with neighbouring Christian kingdoms, and involvement in broader European struggles. For roughly half a century, Granada enjoyed a period of relative peace, punctuated by occasional incidents, but free from sustained assault. It was during this calmer interval that Granada's most enduring symbol took its final shape. The Alhambra, perched above the city on a rocky ridge, had originated as a fortified citadel centuries earlier. Under the Nasrid rulers, especially during the long reign of Muhammad V, it was transformed into a vast palatial complex. It served not only as a residence, but as a self-contained city, complete with fortifications, mosques, administrative buildings, baths, gardens, workshops, and barracks. What makes the Alhambra unique today are the private palaces and courtyards of the ruling family, preserved with remarkable completeness. Against the dramatic backdrop of the Sierra Nevada, these spaces represent the most fully realized surviving palace complex of a medieval Islamic ruler. The architecture embodied a sophisticated aesthetic. Spaces flowed into one another in carefully calculated sequences. Light and shadow were manipulated through the interplay of solid walls and open arches. Surfaces were covered in intricate decoration carved in wood and stucco or set in tile, while water was used as both a visual and symbolic element, reflecting columns and arches, softening light, and animating stillness with movement. Ceilings formed of elaborate geometric patterns created an effect of weightless complexity that astonished visitors, even in its own time. Poets at court celebrated the palace as a jewel set upon the landscape, a place where architecture, nature, and symbolism merged. Artistic exchange crossed religious boundaries. Painters trained in Christian traditions decorated parts of the palace, while Nasrid craftsmen were employed on major Christian commissions elsewhere in Iberia. the movement of people across the frontier was constant, not only artists and builders, but also captives taken in raids or naval attacks. Christian prisoners worked on construction projects, while Muslim communities faced similar fates elsewhere. Frontier officials attempted to regulate these tensions through negotiation, ransom, and investigation, creating a fragile system designed to limit escalation rather than eliminate conflict. Literature from the frontier reflects this atmosphere. Ballads composed in later centuries tell stories of raids, loyalty, betrayal, and tragedy. One of the most haunting is a lament voiced by a Muslim woman, deceived and assaulted by a man who used shared language and custom to gain her trust. Such stories hint at the countless personal tragedies hidden behind the formal treaties and political calculations of the age. The relative calm of the 14th century ended in the early 15th. Castilian forces resumed offensive operations and captured key strongholds, shifting the balance further against Granada. External support from North Africa faded as Moroccan dynasties weakened and naval power declined, allowing Christian fleets to dominate the Western Mediterranean. The capture of strategic ports near the Straits placed Granada in an increasingly isolated position. Internal divisions deepened, the economy stagnated, and foreign merchants tightened their grip on trade. Taxes rose sharply to fund tribute and defence, alienating the population further. By the late 15th century, the conditions for Granada's fall were in place. The crowns of Castile and Aragon were united through marriage, ending centuries of rivalry. A new generation of rulers framed the conquest of Granada as a sacred mission, drawing on historical memory, religious ideology, and the language of crusade. Military strategy emphasized systematic destruction of farmland and sustained sieges rather than risky, pitched battles. When civil war broke out within Granada itself, Christian forces exploited the chaos. One rival claimant was captured and later restored as a puppet ruler, enabling the gradual dismantling of the emirate from within. One by one, Granadan cities fell. The campaign was relentless and methodical. By the end of 1491, Granada itself was surrounded. After months of siege, terms were agreed. On the first day of 1492, Christian troops occupied the Alhambra. The following day, the rulers of Castile and Aragon formally received the keys to the city. Among the witnesses was an Italian navigator seeking royal backing for an ambitious Atlantic voyage. Initially, the conquerors promised continuity. The Muslim population was guaranteed freedom of worship and the right to live under its own laws. In practice, enforcement varied. Some cities suffered harsh reprisals, while others, including Granada, were treated with relative leniency. Over time, however, these guarantees eroded. A policy of persuasion gave way to coercion. Forced conversions followed, triggering rebellion. Suppression was brutal. Eventually, Muslims were offered a choice between baptism and exile under conditions few could meet. Most stayed and became Christians in name only. These new converts remained culturally distinct, practicing their faith in secret and maintaining customs that set them apart. Suspicion grew, fueled by fears of foreign alliances and internal disloyalty. Revolts broke out and were crushed. Populations were forcibly dispersed to break communal ties, spreading tension rather than resolving it. Finally, in the early 17th century, the monarchy chose expulsion. Hundreds of thousands were driven from Spain, removing a skilled and industrious population at enormous economic cost. Some of those expelled turned to piracy and warfare along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts, striking back at the society that had cast them out. A small number remained behind in secrecy, but as a public presence, Islamic Spain had come to an end. What had begun with conquest 9 centuries earlier closed with exile, leaving behind monuments, memories, and a legacy of coexistence and conflict that would continue to shape Spanish history long after the last communities were gone. The fall of the last Muslim-ruled territory in Iberia in 1492 sent a shockwave far beyond the peninsula. In North Africa and the wider Islamic world, the end of Granada was remembered as a wound that never quite closed. Later writers returned to the lost cities of Spain again and again, attaching to their names a quiet wish that the land might one day be restored to Islam. That hope proved durable. For generations, stories circulated in places like Fez and Marrakesh about families who had fled across the sea, carrying almost nothing but memory and a few possessions. Some were said to keep old keys to houses in Malaga, Granada, Almeria, Ronda, hanging on the wall as if a return was simply delayed, not impossible. Yet nostalgia can be a trap. It has a way of turning complicated histories into warm, glowing images that feel true because they are beautiful. Long before Granada fell, a Christian chronicler writing in the 8th century had already described Spain in language that sounded like a poem. Fertile, radiant, abundant, still lovely even after invasion and suffering. That kind of imagery is powerful. It suggests ripeness, peace, and a settled life, like a landscape made for harmony. Over time, later readers began to blend those poetic impressions into a single dream of Islamic Spain, a place of effortless richness and serene order. But the testimonies of people who lived through the peninsula's darker eras resist that dream. Invasions, civil wars, tribal violence, state collapse, and harsh religious pressures were not rare interruptions. They were recurring features. The simplest, most defensible historical conclusion is that medieval al-Andalus was often turbulent, and only sometimes stable. Legends are hard to pierce because they come armoured in emotion. A striking example appears in the Romantic writing of the late 19th century, when a popular narrative took shape in parts of Europe. Muslim Spain was portrayed as a shining beacon of tolerance, enlightenment, and prosperity, and Christian Spain as the force that extinguished it, dragging the country into repression and decline. This version of the story was not just an interpretation of the past. It was also a commentary on the present, shaped by the politics and prejudices of the author's own age. It offered a clean moral contrast, and clean moral contrasts travel well. The problem is not that al-Andalus produced beauty or scholarship. It did. The problem is the claim that these qualities define the society as a whole across centuries, as if they were the everyday condition of most people's lives. A closer look dissolves the neat picture. Tolerance was uneven and often fragile. Jewish communities could flourish in some times and places, then face disaster in others, including moments of mass violence that left lasting scars. Christian minorities lived as protected but subordinate populations, subject to restrictions and periodic pressure. Learning existed, sometimes at a very high level, but it clustered around courts, cities, and small circles of educated elites, rather than spreading broadly through society. Order existed too, but it was frequently undermined by factional conflict, tribal competition, uprisings, and political fragmentation, especially during periods when central authority broke down into rival states. The Romantic image gained extra force because it was reinforced by more than one kind of sentiment. Alongside North African longing for a lost homeland came European fascination with the exotic past of Spain, amplified by travel literature and picturesque retellings. In some versions, this was mixed with a moralizing condemnation of Catholic repression, with the Inquisition serving as a dark symbol. In the modern era, another layer was added: the tendency of some commentators to read later colonial guilt backward into medieval events, treating the Christian conquest and the persecution of converted Muslims as early rehearsals of modern imperial wrongdoing, while often neglecting to apply the same critical lens to earlier Muslim conquest and settlement. When these layers combine, lost homeland nostalgia, romantic spectacle, religious bias, and modern guilt, they create a story that feels emotionally satisfying. It also becomes harder to check because it is no longer simply about evidence. It is about identity and moral positioning. Historical reality is usually less dramatic than the stories told about it. Most of the time, everyday life is routine, and routine does not sell. That is why the past is constantly repackaged, polished, and flavoured, either with glamour or with shame, so that it can be consumed easily. Medieval Spain without a strong narrative hook looks to many people like a complicated, distant world of unfamiliar names and slow-moving change. Add a fantasy of perfect tolerance, or add a tragedy of unbroken oppression, and suddenly it becomes easier to market. The danger is that these neat packages replace the messy texture of real lives. Even in the most cultured phases of al-Andalus, it is difficult to defend the idea of a broadly tolerant and enlightened society in the modern sense. Christian communities living under Muslim rule could be demoralized and constrained, their public life limited, their status clearly inferior to that of Muslims. Some celebrated Muslim intellectuals, often presented today as symbols of open inquiry, could be deeply learned yet intensely polemical, rigid, and dismissive of opposing beliefs. These patterns were not unique to Iberia. They matched the wider structure of minority status in many pre-modern societies. Christians under Muslim rule, like other protected religious minorities elsewhere, occupied a second-tier position. Later, when Muslims lived under Christian rule, many of the same dynamics reappeared in reverse. Legal restrictions, social separation, and periodic coercion. The symmetry is uncomfortable, but it is hard to avoid if the evidence is followed. At this point, it is easy to slide into a sterile argument about whether medieval Iberia was tolerant or intolerant, as if the entire peninsula across 8 centuries must be placed in a single category. That debate usually generates more heat than clarity. A more productive approach is to ask what mattered most in the long arc of history, and what can be said without turning the past into a morality play. From the widest perspective, one central role of al-Andalus was its position as a conduit. At a moment when Latin Christian Europe had limited access to advanced scientific and philosophical traditions, Iberia served as one of the bridges by which knowledge travelled westward. This point is sometimes dismissed as overly focused on Europe's later rise. But the rise of European power between the 14th and 19th centuries is one of the dominant facts of world history, and understanding the channels that fed that transformation is a legitimate historical question. The translation and transmission of texts, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, optics, philosophy, helped reshape what European scholars and institutions could do. That process mattered even if it did not define everyday relations between religions. Beyond translations, many other forms of influence may have flowed through the frontier zones of Iberia and the Mediterranean. Ideas about holy war, models for frontier fortifications and religious military institutions, patterns of poetic expression and courtly love, even possible echoes in major works of European literature. These questions have generated long debate, and many remain unresolved. Proof is uneven, connections are hard to trace, and scholars often disagree. Still, the broader outline is difficult to deny. Contact between medieval Islam and medieval Christendom was not only conflict, it was also exchange, and some of that exchange left deep marks. Yet the exchange was not balanced. Muslim writers in al-Andalus generally showed little curiosity about their Christian neighbours. Descriptions of Christian lands in Islamic geographical writing could be dismissive and thin. reducing the north to cold weather, rough people, strange food, and the possibility of acquiring slaves. In that sense, the Muslim discovery of Europe came late, long after the fall of Granada. On the other side, many Christians were equally incurious about Islam as a faith. They were eager to acquire useful knowledge, books, techniques, instruments, but often unwilling to understand the religious world that had produced them. Even when some churchmen gained access to Islamic texts, their purpose could be refutation rather than comprehension. In both directions, stereotypes were easier than investigation, and inherited myths were often more comfortable than the truth. This can leave a bleak impression. Two cultures living in proximity, trading blows and borrowing tools, yet rarely making sustained efforts to understand one another at a deep level. Even that judgment, however, must be handled carefully, because most of the surviving voices belong to a narrow, literate elite: clerics, scholars, officials, court writers. Their worldview was shaped by polemic, doctrine, and politics. They were not always good witnesses to ordinary social reality, and they were rarely cheerful observers. Daily life could be more mixed than formal texts suggest. People worked together, traded, hired musicians, shared streets and marketplaces, and sometimes formed friendships that official law codes tried to prevent. If the record preserved more of those everyday moments, the overall picture might look less like a lecture and more like a lived world, messy, contradictory, and human. The challenge, then, is not to replace one legend with another, but to strip away the easy sources, glamour, guilt, nostalgia, condemnation, and let the past taste like what it was: a long history of power and survival, brilliance and cruelty, routine and crisis, with real people making choices under pressures they did not control. That is harder to package, but it is closer to understanding.